Hello and welcome. This is Lee Waller, and I am working in Unreal Engine 5.5's motion design tools. In this tutorial, I'm going to take a look at how I built this scene, this motion graphic here, featuring R2D2. I'm going to try to focus a lot on the new material designer. I'm not going to go into deep explanation of it, but a lot of what you see in this scene has to do with the material designer and how you can use it. If you haven't used the new motion design tools in Unreal, I have a tutorial on how I set up my scenes if you want to jump out of this one and take a look at that. Before we get started, I want to make a few adjustments to the sequencer down here. I'm going to change the frame rate from 5994 to 30 frames per second, and then I'm going to add some time to the sequence. Go right here and I'm going to type in 450. Which 30 frames per second at 450 frames, that's going to be a 15-second sequence. And then I'm going to hit the set play back end to the current position, which brings that red bar back here to the timeline indicator right there. And so now we have a 15-second long sequence. The first piece that I want to create is the floor. So I'm going to start off with a rectangle. So over here in our motion design tools under 2D shapes, I'm going to double click on the rectangle. There's our first rectangle, and I'm going to go ahead and label this floor. And we'll make some adjustments in the details panel for that floor. I'm going to drop down first to the mesh size and adjust that. I'm going to leave it locked right there, and we're going to set both of these to 5,000. Then I'll jump back up to the location and rotation and make some changes there. On the location, I'm going to drop this down to a -200. On the Z-axis, and then we're going to rotate it on the Y-axis right here to a -90. And the look for this floor is created by creating the material for it. And so I'm going to drop down here in the details panel to the material properties, and under material type, I'm going to change from simple, and we're going to go into the material designer right there. This is the new material designer in 5.5. On the material type, I'm going to leave it on PBR, and that stands for physically based rendered. And then we'll click on continue there. In the editor, you have a number of tabs here across this section. This, of course, is the preview of the material. And so you can move that around, zoom in, zoom out on it. The first tab is the global settings. And oftentimes, if we're going to change anything in here, it will be the blending mode, but I'm going to leave the blending mode for this one as opaque. Then you'll see all of these tabs here. They'll show up under the channels, and you can make final adjustments as to the strength of each of these channels in this area. To affect the actual channel itself, you'll go into that tab, and there is where you can create your different looks. So for this material, I'm going to mainly work in the base color. On this base layer right here, I'm going to change this. Right now it's a texture, and I want a color here. So I'm going to click on this little swatch right there. This gives us the option to change what the source is, and I'm going to change this to solid color. You'll see that it goes to black, and then right down here we can actually change the color. We can click on that swatch, and now we have the color picker. I have a hexadecimal for this, a hex linear, and so I'm just going to select this, and the hex linear for this is going to be 0065FFFF. I'm going to type that in and just click in there, and you'll see that light blue color that I've added in. I'm going to hit OK there. That's the base color of this material. And one nice option that they've improved quite a bit and added to quite a bit is you can add effects to each of these layers. So I'm going to add a grid effect to this layer. To do that with it selected, I'll go to FX right there, and then we're going to add in under generators, grid lines. And you'll see the grid lines applied, and you have adjustments for those right down here. So make sure that that effect is selected right there, and you'll have these options to work with. Let me see if I can increase the size of this a little bit so we can see this. And I'm going to make some adjustments to this to create the grids that I want, but you can see as I just kind of scrub through these, how they affect the different looks you can create. So I'm going to reset those back. And for the lines that I created, the properties I'm going to change here, the width to 50 and the height to 50. And the line thickness, I'm going to set to 0.05. The stagger offset I'm going to leave, and the corner radius I'm going to set to 0.2. I'll zoom into this just so we can get a better look. And you can also see it a little bit right there. I'll slide off to the side just a little bit. And I'm going to change these colors. Actually going to change this A color right here to another blue. And the hexadecimal for that is 0479FFFF. Again, I'll just click in there so I can preview that. You'll see that the lines change to that color there, and I'll hit OK. So right now the effect is overlaid on this color, and it is completely covering up that color. So I want to blend it in a little bit. So I'll go down here to the effect amount, and I'll drop that down to 50%. So at this point, I'm going to blend this in with some of the other channels. So I'm just going to drop in here to channels and make a few adjustments. On the roughness right here, the roughness is going to be how reflective this is. And so right now it is set at 1, which is the highest value for roughness, which means actually that it's not going to be very reflective. If I set this down to 0, you'll see that it's very reflective. I'm just going to back off of that just a little, set it to 0.1, and on the specular, I'm going to set that to 0.5. So I want to save this in case I want to use it later. Now I know in this project I'm not going to, but just to show you how to save this, I'm going to go up here to Save As, and I need to create a folder for these materials. I'm selecting content right there so that I know that's where that folder is going to show up. I'm going to right click, New Folder, and I'm going to label this My Materials, and double click on that folder. We're in that folder now, and so I'll save this. I'm going to label it. I'm going to leave the MD on there for Material Designer, and I will label this Grid Lines and hit Save on that. So now I have that saved, and back in my content drawer right there, you can see that I have that material created. I'll just select it right there and hit Control S to make sure it's completely saved. And anytime I want to recall this material now, I have it right there. I can close this out, and there is our floor. In the original animation, R2D2 comes through the floor, and I create what appears to be a hole in the floor, and then that hole closes up after he has come through it. To do that, we're going to use an ellipse and a couple of modifiers, both on the floor and on that ellipse. Now I'm going to go ahead and apply the modifiers to the floor first. Make sure that the floor is selected, and we'll go into the operator stack right there. If you don't have this operator stack tab, slide over here to the far left, and you'll see operator stack. Just click on that, and it should open up. Here's where we can add in the modifiers, and the modifiers that I want to add in is first, I want to extrude this. We're not going to see this extrude at first, but once we create that hole, you'll see how this takes effect. And so there's this extrude modifier. The other modifier that I need to add is the Boolean modifier, and this is how we're going to cut a hole in this floor with the ellipse. So both the ellipse and the floor are going to need the Boolean modifier. So I'm going to click on Add. I'm going to go down to Boolean and add that in. And then right here, we do want the floor to be the target. We'll adjust this for the ellipse once we add that into the ellipse. So let's go add in the ellipse now. I'll go back to Motion Design Outliner right here. And to add this ellipse in, back in the 2D shapes, I'm just going to double click on the ellipse. There is the ellipse. We're going to, of course, make some adjustments to this. And so with it selected, I'm going to go into first thing under shape for this ellipse, sides. I'm just going to go ahead and increase that up to, I'll drag that down and show you. If I drag this way down, you'll see the sides that are being created to create this ellipse. So we want more of them so that is a much rounder ellipse. So right now I'm down to 10, but I'm going to crank that all the way up to 128 so that it's a very smooth ellipse, a very smooth circle. You'll see that more whenever, say, the camera zooms in on it. You'll see where those sides start showing up. And so the more that you have in there, the closer you'll be able to zoom into this shape. Under mesh size, I'm going to bring this up to 650 for both of those. And then up here in our rotation, I'm going to go ahead and rotate this on the y-axis to a -90. Before I bring this down, I want to add in the modifiers so that you can see how they're affecting this. So with that ellipse selected, I'll go up to Operator Stack, and of course, just like we did a minute ago, add modifiers. I'm going to add the Extrude modifier, And there you see it extruding that ellipse. And then we'll add in the Boolean modifier. And let me bring this down. We want to actually make this, it does not need to be the target. So we're going to go into our target right there and we're going to select subtract. So now I'm going to start moving it down. And you'll see here in a moment, it's starting to cut a hole in the floor. We still have a floor, and the reason for that is the depth of our extrude of the ellipse kind of versus the depth of the extrusion of the floor. So if we extrude farther with the ellipse, that floor will disappear. So back in the extrusion depth for the ellipse, I'm going to increase that. And you'll see once we pass the extrusion for the floor, we lose that right there. And that can very well be the effect that we want. Now, I do want a deeper wall here on this. So I'm going to go back into the floor and go to the operator stack for it. Let me make sure I'm on floor. Yep. And I'll go back into operator stack and I'll bring that on down. I'm actually going to bring that down. I'll probably go ahead and set it to 100. Then, like we were just doing a moment ago, I'll go back into the ellipse, go into the operator stack, and I'll set that to 110. And so that way we have a wall here, and then we also have an open space. I mentioned earlier that after R2D2 comes up through this hole closes. So I'm going to go ahead and set up that animation now. To do that, back in the motion design outliner right here, I'm going to need to bring that ellipse into the sequencer. I'm going to go ahead and label this real quick so that we know what it is. I'm going to label this floor Boolean ellipse. Then I'll drag this into the sequencer and drop it. And I want to add in a particular property that we're going to animate on that. That's actually the mesh size. So again, with that selected, I'll drop into the details here for this. And I'm going to add this mesh size in. And to do that, I'm going to click this keyframe button right here. It adds in a keyframe on mesh size underneath that ellipse. That's not actually where I want that to start. I want it to start at 60 frames. So I'm going to drag that over, and right there on 60 frames is where I want this animation to start. And we'll give it about a second animation time. So I'll bring that to 90 frames. And I'm going to bring that property down from 650 to 0. And now we can go back to the beginning of the timeline, play through that, and you'll see that close up. All right, so we have the floor in. We've animated our opening that R2D2 is going to come through. Next thing that I want to do is add in our back wall. Our back wall is going to be made of a rectangle, just like our floor. So again, in 2D shapes, I'm just going to double click rectangle right there. And I'll go ahead and label this back wall so we can keep up with it. With it selected, I'm going to make some adjustments. I'm going to drop down here again to the mesh size, and we'll make this 5,000 by 5,000. And definitely going to need to push this back away from us. So under location there, we'll push this away from us. I'm going to set that to 2505. And you'll see that it's pretty much back there at the back of our floor. And then I'm going to bring it up to about 871. So now I want to create the material for this back wall. So with the back wall selected, I'm going to drop down here to material. Under material type, I'm going to choose from simple to material designer. And I'm going to go with emissive on this one. An emissive material does not need a light for the material to shine or to show through. It emits its own light. So you can increase the strength of the emissive material and it'll actually start creating light in the scene. I'm not going to use it quite that strong, but I still, because there's not going to be much lighting on the back wall, I'm going to make it an emissive material. So select emissive, hit continue. And I'm going to go here into the emissive color. I'm going to change this from a texture to a solid color. And we're going to choose that color right there under the hex linear right here. We're going to go with 0067 FFFF. Hit OK on that. And we're going to add another effect to this. So with that layer selected, we'll come over here to the effects button, and I'm going to go right here to alpha, and we're going to use this PolkaDots alpha. I'll zoom out a little bit. Probably won't get a good look at this until we get it in the scene. I'll slide this over. There we go. And I'm going to make some adjustments to this. I'm going to leave this texture as is. I'm going to bring the scale down to 90. The size I'm going to set to 1.5. Right now the resolution is creating kind of an oval shape with these dots. I want them round, so make sure this is not locked, and then I'm just going to set this to 1920 by 1920. And so now all of the dots are circles or rounded. To add movement into this back wall, I'm going to animate two of these properties, this UV offset right here, and then also this shift right here. So I want to add both of those into the sequencer. So let me reset those, and these will add in a little bit differently. I'm going to go to the three dots here, click on that, and hit the create key for both of them. And so hopefully your timeline indicator was at the very beginning. It sets a keyframe for both of those, adds that in, that back wall in with those two properties added in. And I can close this out now. If your keyframes were not there, just select both of them and drag it to the beginning. And then I'm going to jump to the end. I'm going to click here on this to the end button right there. And I'm going to add in the amount of change that I want for both of these. So on the UV offset, I'm going to go here to the vector 2D right there and open that up. And there's our X and our Y. I'm only going to affect the X property on this. We do want it to start off at 0. Down here at the end, we want it to have changed to 7.5. And then back up here on the shift, I'm going to set that last keyframe to 20. And then I'm going to jump back to the beginning and set that to 2.5. That first keyframe to 2.5. So again, on these two properties, this bottom one here, the vector 2D, we want the first keyframes to be 0, and then the second keyframe down here at the end to be 7.5 on the X value. I'm not adjusting the Y, but if that's something you want to play with and animate, you feel free to do that. And then on the shift here, the second keyframe set it to 20, and the first keyframe I had it set at 2.5. Now, all of those keyframes, I want to make sure that they're linear, because right now what they'll do is they'll start off slow, ramp up in speed, hit a maximum speed right there in the middle, and then start ramping back down. So I want them to be constant across, so I'm going to select all of them, and actually that bottom one there I don't need, but select those four, right-click on them, and go to linear. And so now they'll be constant. Let's see, select these again, and right-click on any one of them, set it to linear, and that should set all of them to linear. And so now let's see what we've got. Jump back to the beginning of the timeline, hit play, and there is our animated background. I'm going to go ahead and save everything. I'm going to hit Command-Shift-S to make sure that everything is saved. I'm going to go ahead at this point and add in R2D2. Now, to get that asset, we're going to go to a website, videocopilot.net, and I'll have this link down in the description. Click on that link and it's going to open you up to videocopilot.net, and they have this article here in their blog. This Saber plugin is great if you're into After Effects and need to create lightsabers and all types of effects like this. It works really well. I've used it quite a bit. But they also have down here, scroll on down and you'll see download the model pack. You're going to want to download that model pack, and then you're also going to want to download the JPEG map files there. So just click on those for download, save them wherever you want to, and also the JPEGs. Once you download those, you're going to need to unzip them and gain access to those files. And then we're going to import some of those files into Unreal Engine. I'm going to go into the content drawer, and I'm going to create a folder for my R2D2. So under content right there, I'm going to right click and new folder, and I'm going to label this R2D2. I'm going to open that up, and then I'm going to add one more folder just to kind of keep things organized. This will be for my R2D2 materials. And while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and open this up and import those materials first. So I'm going to right click in here, go to import, and I'm going to need to navigate to where I have those assets. In the Star Pack JPEG, which you should have unzipped that you downloaded from Video Copilot, you'll open that up, go into the Star Pack there, and then we want R2 unit, and we want these 5 textures here. So select those and hit open. It's going to import, and then it's going to tell you that it did import the normal map as a normal map, which is what we want it to do. We can select all of those just to save them real quick. Control S. And we'll create a material using these in just a little bit. I'm going to jump back one folder and we'll go ahead and import the R2 unit. So right here in our R2D2 folder, I'm going to right click and go to import. And again, navigate to where I opened up those folders. This should be under the VC Star Pack. I'm going to double click there, Star Pack, and I'm going to bring in that R2 unit OBJ right there. Hit open. I did a lot of trial and error on this, and so I want these to come in as separate pieces. That's going to make it a little bit easier when we have to add the materials in so that we get them correct. So one property I want to make sure is deselected is I do not want to select combine static meshes. Make sure that is deselected. Then hit import. It brings in all of the separate pieces, and that can be useful if you want to animate this more than what we do in this project. But I need to combine all of these, and I'm going to do that using a blueprint. I will select all of them real quick and save them. And then I'm going to create a blueprint so that we can add all of these in. I'm going to right click in here, and then I'm going to add in blueprint class right there. I want this to be an actor, and I'm going to label this R2D2, and then we'll need to open that up. I'm going to dock this right up here so that I can jump to it a little bit more easily. But this is the blueprint that we want to create R2D2 in. To do that, right down here, I'm going to open up my content drawer. That's why I docked it up here at the top, so it'll make it easier for me to grab all these pieces and drag them in. I'm going to select them. Make sure you don't select the blueprint because it's not going to allow you to drop that in, but I'm just using the Shift and Control options to select all of these. And once I have them all selected, I'm going to drop them in, and you'll see that it creates R2D2 for us. This is the mesh, of course. And you'll see that he's laying down and we want him to stand up. So I'm going to select all of these. And then using my rotation tool up here, I'm going to make sure that my snapping is selected right here so that it'll snap at 10 degrees. And we'll bring this on up and rotate him 90 degrees, and he is standing up. And I'll just kind of bring him into view. And now what we'll do is we will create the materials for this. I'm just going to select one of the pieces here, and then I'm going to drop over here to materials, and I'm going to create this with the material designer. We do want this to be a full PBR because we're going to take use of many of these channels, not all of them, but a few of them. And we'll hit continue. And I'll slide this over a little bit because I'm going to need room also for my content drawer. So we'll take a look at these textures that we've imported. So back in our content drawer, there's the R2D2 materials. We'll open that up. You'll see that we have diffuse, illumination, normal, reflection, and specular. So I'm going to add these into different channels here. We'll start off with the base channel right there, and I'll go back to the content drawer. We're going to use the diffuse on this. And so the diffuse is basically the color of the entire piece. So I'm going to grab that and I'm going to drag it and drop it right there. And you'll see there is our material starting to come together. And I'm going to add one effect to this because this is a little dark and I want to brighten it up just a little bit. So with that layer selected, I'm going to go into effects. I'm going to drop down to color and I'm going to add in the brightness and contrast effect there. After the shaders have been created on this, I'm just going to bring up the brightness to 1.5. So you'll see that it brightens that up a little bit, and you can work with that to change that to whatever effect you're looking for. The next channel I'm going to go to is the emissive. And back in my content drawer right here, what I'm looking at is the illumination. These are the little lights that are on the unit. And so we're going to drop those into the emissive so that if we want them to glow a little bit, we can increase the amount of emissive strength for these. So I'm going to grab that right there, drop it in right there, and you'll see that they're starting to show up. To adjust the brightness of this or how much they glow or emit light in the channels, you'll see now that these two textures are showing up. And right there under emissive color, that is the strength for it. And so if I want that to shine a little bit more, I can bring that up to 10. That's probably too much. I'm going to leave it at 1, but that is a value that you can work with. The next channel I'm going to go to is specular. In the specular channel here, we want to make sure that that is selected, and we'll go to our content drawer. There is our specular texture. I'm going to bring that in and drop it right there. It's going to build shaders, of course. The next channel will be metallic. And in our content drawer, we want reflection. So we'll grab that texture, bring it over and drop it in. And the last one we want is normal. And we have a normal map here. So we'll bring that in and drop it. I'm going to need to do a save as on this. So we're going to click on save as. So I'll just keep this in the R2D2 materials right here. And I'm going to leave the MD underscore and we'll just label this as R2D2 and hit save. Remember that it is in that R2 folder under R2 materials. I'll close this out. We'll go back into our blueprint here for the R2 unit. You see that it has added it in to that first lower leg that we were working with. But what we want to do now is add that material into the rest of this. So I'm just going to select all of them. And then we can go over here to element 1 and we can look for that. MD underscore R, there it is. And we can select that and it adds it to the rest of the parts. And you see now we have our R2 unit. The only part that we're missing at this point is glass right in there and right there. So we're going to create that material. That material is actually located under the head right there. So I'm just going to select it and you'll see it's the only one that has 2 elements for a material. Element 0 being the main body. So if we look at the other pieces, you'll see that all of the other pieces just have that element 0 with the main material, main texture applied to it. But the head has the main body material applied, and then we need to create this glass piece for these two. To do that, I am going to start a new material right here. I'm going to create with Material Designer, and I'm just going to go with the PBR, hit continue. We're only going to use this base color, and I'm going to actually add in one of the textures that we've already used. It'll be the illumination. I'm going to add it in to the base color there. And we will make an adjustment to the roughness channel right here. This is going to make it look glossy, a little bit more like glass. Under the roughness channel, this first layer, I'm going to change this base layer color right here from a texture to a solid color, and then change this color to white. And then we're going to jump back into the channels here, and under roughness, we're going to set that to 0. I'm going to save this out, save as, and I'm going to label this MD underscore R2D2 glass. And I'm going to close that out, go back into our blueprint for the unit, and we'll need to add that in. So right here, I'm going to select MD underscore R2, and there's our glass. We'll add that in. All right. And so now we've got a glass look there. We'll compile this, save it, and we have our R2 unit ready to go. I'm going to close that out, and now we can bring the R2 unit into the scene. Back in the content drawer, we'll go to our main R2 folder right there. There's the blueprint where we've created him. I can click on that, drag that in, and drop him in there. And we'll make some adjustments. We'll 0 this out. So we're just going to reset the location for him. And then I'm going to bring this up in size. I think scale this up to 3.5. And I need to do that on all axes right there. I'm going to scrub through the timeline just a little bit so that we can close that up, and then I'll bring him down so that he starts setting on the floor. I think we're intersecting with the floor right there. And then we'll rotate him so that we can see the front of him. So we'll set that to 90 degrees. And there is our R2 unit. Now that we have R2 in there, let's go ahead and animate him. Just like we've done the other objects we've been animating, we're going to need to add him to the sequencer. So let's take a look in our motion design outliner here. There's the R2 unit blueprint right there. We'll grab that, drag that, and drop it in. And we're going to need to add the transform properties to this. So click on the plus button right there and go up to transform. And we're going to just animate him on location on the Z axis. So I'm going to drop this back to the beginning of the timeline. Actually, I think I'm going to start this at 15 frames in just to give us half a second right there at the beginning of the animation before he starts moving in. And I'll set a keyframe on the Z axis right there. And I'm going to remember that -200. That's where we want him to end up. So I'm going to go ahead and scrub this down, and we'll get him below the floor a little bit. Maybe -725. We'll just somewhere in there. I'm going to give this 2 full seconds. So I'll jump to 75 frames in for him to pop in, and then we'll bring him back up to that -200. And so at that point, he's animated in. I do want to change the interpolation on this first keyframe so that it starts off quicker. So I'm going to set that to linear, and then it'll ease into that stop as he comes up. So let's jump back to the beginning of the timeline and hit play on that. He comes up, eases into that stop, and then the hole closes underneath him. Take a look at that one more time. Okay, once I created that animation and I tried to save this, I was having a problem saving the main level, which, let me show you, you may be running into the same thing. This right here, this is what we're working in. This main level is what we're working in. So we need that to save. The issue was this. I'm going to go back to the R2 unit and open up the blueprint. On this first part that we were working on where we created the material, we had the original material in there. What we needed to do was also add in this MD underscore R2D2 so that, because that original material, once we saved it, no longer existed. I don't know why that doesn't update. Maybe that's a glitch that they'll fix. So what you need to do is just go in here and find that material right there and add it in. So MD underscore R2D2. Of course, there it is. That's the one that we've made. Select it, and then you should be able to compile, save that, close this up, and then you can save that main level. So Control S and Control Shift S to make sure that everything is saved. Hopefully that fixes that problem. Now I'm going to take a look at the camera so we can kind of start adjusting this scene. Just going to scroll some things here closed so that we can see this. Open up our motion design outliner right here. I'm going to go into the default scene, and we already have a camera in here. And so that Avalanche Cinema Camera Actor 0 right there, we can select it. I'm going to make just a few changes to it. We do need to unlock it so that we can use it. And I'm going to drop down here into the current camera settings. Film back right here, lens setting right there. I want to change that lens setting. I'm going to go from a universal zoom to a 50 millimeter, and then we're going to start positioning this. I'm going to move this camera away from everything, draw it back closer as we're behind the camera. We're going to bring it to a -3000 right there. And we're going to need to work on our focus a little bit. So I'm going to go into the focus settings. And because we're going to create a sign back here that we want to see in focus, I'm going to go ahead. I'll just draw that plane there to see where the focus is. You'll see that everything behind this plane is out of focus. So I'm just going to start pushing that away from us and just get it right back there to that back wall. Let's see, where is that? Looks like it's around 6,000. I can actually use the dropper there and just click And that way I know that that back wall is in focus and everything from there to the camera is in focus. And we can get rid of that focus plane right there. And the last thing I'm going to do on the camera is I'm just going to drop this down to a negative 315. Kind of gets us in position. And we'll keep building out the scene from here. Let's save this. Control-Shift-S to save everything. The next part I want to build is the text that rotates around R2-D2. There's the text, there's a fill for that text, and then there's an outline for that text. Then we also have the ring that is also circling around R2-D2. I'm going to build the ring first, and then we'll work on the text. The ring is pretty simple. We'll actually use a 2D shape ring. So let's go to 2D shapes, and we'll double click on the ring right there. To start off, I'm going to reset the location right there. Just click that reset arrow. It'll bring it back to the center. I'll bring it out just a little bit so we can see it. Then we'll have to push it back to that 0 position. But on the sides there, I'm going to bring this up to 128. And then on the inner size right there, I'm going to scrub that up and down, and you'll see how that inner size affects the ring. I'm going to set that to 0.97. And then on the mesh size right here, I'm going to bring this up to 619 on both the X and Y. And then let me reset that position again. And I'm going to need to rotate this on the Y axis to a negative 90. I'm going to drop down to the material. I'm going to leave it as a simple material type and just change the color here. On this hex linear, I'm going to type in 006DFFFF. Hit OK on that. And then we're going to need to extrude this. So we're going to add some modifiers to it. Make sure the ring is selected. We'll go up to the operator stack, and we're going to add the modifier to extrude. And then we'll also add the modifier to bevel this. I'm going to open up those details so we can see that. And on the extrude, I'm going to set that to 70. And on the bevel inset right there, I'm going to set that to 2. Back in the Motion Design Outliner with that ring selected, we'll go back into the details. I want to go to the location, and we're going to bring this down to a negative 116. The text for this is a little more complicated for 2 reasons. One, there's a fill, and then there's an outline. So those are going to be 2 separate text actors. But then we're also, so that we can wrap them around this ring, they're also going to be set in a cloner. And for that cloner to use them correctly, all of the letters in those 2 text pieces are going to need to be converted to meshes. So to start this process, I'll go into Actors. I'm going to go to Text Actor, double click on that, and we'll set this up for one line, which will be the R2-Series mech droid. We're going to have 2 copies of that, one for the fill, one for the outline. So with that text actor selected, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to type in that line of text. And then I'm going to make all of that uppercase. I'm going to change the font from Roboto to Impact. On the alignment, center align that for both of them. And then kern this just a little bit. This will bring some spacing in between those letters. I need 2 instances of this. Again, one for the fill and one for the outline. So let me go ahead, now that we've got that set up, and duplicate this. So we have 2 instances. Doesn't really matter which one you start off with. Just select one of them. I'm going to go with that second one right there. I'm going to go ahead and hide the first one so that we don't see it and get confused by it. But we're going to need to convert this to meshes. To do that, with it selected, we're going to have to change the mode over here from Motion Design, and we're going to need to go to Modeling Mode. We're going to go into the Transform tab right there, and we're going to use this Convert button. Click it, and you'll see that it's going to convert these to a static mesh. Just hit Accept. And now over here in our Motion Design Outliner, you'll see that we have a mesh for every letter in that text. Now, unfortunately, the way this works out, this probably is not in order. I'm going to start clicking through here, and you can see that they are not in order. So we're going to need to go through, label each one of them, and then order them from bottom to top left to right. So starting over here, this R will need to be at the bottom of the stack. And then we'll go from there to the top. To make this a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and hide R2 right there. So this first one is that first R. So I'm just going to select that, and I'm going to type in R1 because there's a couple of different R's in this, and hit enter. Select the next one. That's the M. That's the number 2. And that is my third E. And so I'm just going to continue doing this till I have every mesh labeled. After I've labeled each text, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to need to lay these out from bottom to top, left to right. So I'll start with R1. I'm going to need to bring that all the way down here to the bottom, set that in, and then I'm going to need to find that number 2, bring it in, drop it right there. I'm going to need the dash, and then we'll need the first S. And I'll just continue this out till I have it in the correct order. Once we have it laid out in order, we're going to need to add some spaces in here. We're going to need a space here, and either at the front or the end of this. To create those spaces, we'll use a null object. I'm going to click on the word label right there so that it deselects everything, because I don't want to add this null object to anything. And so I'll just click on this 3 times, add those null objects in. They're right down here at the bottom. I'll leave this null 1 right here. And then I'll grab one of the other nulls, and I'm going to bring it up and drop it in between the words series and mech right there. And then I'll grab another null and bring it up and drop it in between mech and droid. This way, whenever we drop it into the cloner, it'll have those spaces in there. We're now ready to add in the cloner and place these in the cloner. So in our modes here, I'm going to click on this and go back to the motion design mode. I'll go to Actors tab right there, and I'm going to go to the cloner actor and double click on it. I'm going to open that up, and it has the default cube in there, so we're going to need to delete that. Select it and hit delete. And we're going to add all of this into that cloner. There is a proper way of doing this. I'm not sure why it matters, but in all of my work on this, many trials and errors, the way to get all of this in order is to start at the top of the stack, select the very top, drop all the way to the bottom. We'll need that bottom null actor, and select it by hitting shift click so that all of those pieces are selected. And then we're going to drag that into the cloner. That way, when we drop them all into the cloner, again, that stacking order is correct, starting left to right from the bottom to the top. I'm going to close all of that up, and there's the cloner for that text. You'll see that the cloner right now is in grid mode, so we're going to need to change that. So with the cloner selected in our details panel, let's drop down to the layout. There's our layout grid. We'll select that and choose circle. Our line of text plus the 3 spaces that we add in for that equals up to 21 objects. So on this count here, I want 2 instances of that line of text. So I'm going to add that up to 42 and set that count to 42. I always forget this, but our text objects are all facing in on that circle. So we need them facing out. So I hate to do this, but I'm going to go back into the cloner, select all of those objects using shift select there. And then we'll need to rotate that in the transform properties to 180 degrees on that Z axis there. Now all of our text is facing outward. I'll close this cloner back up. We're going to need to make a few more adjustments to this so that our text drops down here around this ring that we created. Let me bring this up a little bit and I'm going to try the radius of 300 for right now. We may need to adjust that a little bit more. Then I'm going to start scrubbing this down to get it into place. Yeah, we're going to need to come out a little bit more on that. So back to that radius, bring that out till we see our text just slightly outside of it. And then maybe adjust our height again just a little bit. The way we're going to animate this, and I'll animate it a little bit later, but the way we're going to animate it is with this angle start right there. And so you can see that it is rotating around. Now, there is one issue that I'm going to deal with. The M is a little too close. And the way to fix that, or at least the way that I have found to fix that, is we're going to need to select that M. Let me reset that angle start right there. Actually, I'll move it around so that I can see that M. And I'm going to need to go into the cloner and find that M and select it. So right there, make sure that that M is selected. We'll need to go back over to our modeling mode right here. And we're going to transform this. And we want to transform the edit pivot right there, the pivot point of this M. So with that selected, go to edit pivot. And we want to, right here in our box position, we want to click on center and then bottom so that it doesn't look like it right now, but that pivot point is in the center of that M and it's right down there at the bottom. Once we've clicked on center and bottom, then we can hit accept. And you'll notice now that that M spaces more properly. I'll go from modeling mode back to motion design mode there, and we can close that cloner up. And we have our first text object in there. For the second text, we want it to be the outline. This is the fill. This will be the outline of it. This is actually where we're going to get our lighting from for this section of the design. So with that text selected, we'll drop down into the details, and we're going to need to look for outline. That should be right there under geometry, outline, select that. Let me go ahead, and we need to make this visible, and we'll make the cloner invisible right here. And so there's our outline text. I'm going to give this just a little bit of geometry to it. And so I'm going to set that extrude to 2. So now we have our outline. We do need to convert this and then add it to the cloner just like we did earlier. With that selected, let's go back into our modeling mode. We'll go into transform. We're going to convert that. Static mesh, hit accept. And there are all of our meshes for each text. Just like we did earlier, we're going to need to go through each one of these, label them, and lay them out in the correct order. Once you have labeled those and you have it in order again, left to right, top to bottom, we'll need to add in 3 spaces. So with nothing selected, just click on that word label right there. We'll click on that null object 3 times and we can add those in and then place those null objects. We can leave that first one right there. And then we'll bring this between series and mech and then bring one more between mech and droid right there. Now we can add in another cloner. So we'll go from modeling mode back to motion design mode, go to our actors right there, double click on that cloner, go to that second cloner, select it and open it up. We're going to get rid of that default cube right there, delete it. Just like before, we're going to need to select this in the correct order. We'll start at the top of the stack. So on that D2 right there, we'll select it, then drop all the way to the bottom of the stack, that last null actor right there, hold down shift and click it. Then we can drag all of those objects into the cloner too right there and drop it. Now they're in that cloner in the correct order. And we can go to that cloner too and make some changes so that it lines up with our other text. Just like we did before, we'll go down here to the layout, go from grid to circle. We'll change our count from 9 to 42. And let's take a look at what our radius was. I'm going to set that to 317 and we'll go back to our cloner 2 and set that to 317 so that the two match. Let me change this angle start back to 0 And then our position, -176 on cloner 2, we'll set that to -176. And we do need to face all of our outlines outwards rather than inward. So back in that cloner 2, I always forget this step. We'll select all of them, shift select, and then we'll change that on this rotation here to a -180. Now they're all facing outward. We can close that cloner up, and then we can bring back in our original fill text. You don't see much difference there, but once we get the materials created for these two, you'll see how all of this works together. I almost forgot this, but we do need to adjust the M on our outlines. So I'm going to hide the fills. And while we're doing this, let's go ahead and label these. This top one's going to be our fill. So I'm going to label this R2-Series text fill. And then this bottom one, I'm going to label it R2-Series outline. Make sure I've got that right. Yep. And I'm going to hide the fill for right now. And on that outline, we need to change that M, adjust that M so that it spaces properly. So select it, back over here to modeling mode, transform, edit pivot, and then we're going to set center and bottom and then hit accept, and that will space that properly. We can jump back into our motion design mode right there and take a look at all of it. I'm going to create the fill material first. And so I'm going to open it up and just select one of these objects. Doesn't matter which one. I will start with this last D right there. It's right at the top. Very easy to get to. We'll use it to create the material. Then we'll have to apply that material back to itself and then to all of the others. So with it selected, we'll go into Create with Material Designer. And I'm going to go with a translucent material. I want this to be semi-transparent. So select translucent and then hit continue. And you'll see that we only have an emissive and an opacity channel on this. I'm going to work in the opacity channel. To create the look, we're going to use 2 layers on this. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the second layer. So right here on the plus button, it'll be a texture layer. So select texture right there. I'm going to just blend this white with what we create on this second layer. So to do that, I'm going to change the blending mode from normal to difference. And then we'll drop down here and select this base layer texture right here. Make sure that it is selected. And we're going to change that texture. Go to the drop down menu and we're going to search for T_default texture. And I want this T default texture 2D right here. Select it, and we're going to add some effects to this. So with that second layer selected, go to Effect. And the first one we're going to add is Pixelate. So drop down to the Pixelate right there. Pixelate UV, select it. We'll make some changes down here to the pixel size and the texture size. On the pixel size, I'm going to set that to 65. Make sure that both of those are locked together, and we'll just set this to 500. To animate that, we're going to add in a panner, so another effect. So again, with that layer selected, go to Effects, and we'll drop down to Distort, and we're going to go over to Panner UV, and you should see it after it builds the shader, start animating all of this. That's a little fast, so I'm going to set this down to 0.1. And the last thing that I'm going to do is add one more effect to this. And I'm going to go into color and bring in a brightness and contrast because I want to brighten this up just a little bit. Set that to 4 so that we can apply this material to all of the other text objects. We need to save it. So I'm going to right here in the upper right hand corner, click on that, go to Export Material, Designer Material, and I'm going to leave that MD in there. And I'm going to label this as hologram text. And we'll hit save on that. And we can close that out. You'll see the D has that in there right now, but I do need to, because it's actually not the one that we saved. So we need to go ahead and change that. We'll change that first. So click on that search menu right there, and we'll do MD_hologram. There it is right there. We'll select it so that make sure that it is the correct material. Then we'll need to select all of the other text objects in there. So I'm just going to select that I, drop all the way down to the R here, hit Shift, select them, and then we don't need the null objects. Then we can bring this back up and apply that material. So again, MD_hologram. And that material now has been applied to all of the text objects. We can close that cloner up, and now we'll need to work on the outline for this. The outline is going to be a lot easier. Just like we did for the fill, we're going to open this up and select one of the text objects. I'll start with that last D right there. All of these are going to have two elements to the material. We're going to just create the one material and apply it to both of them. So it doesn't matter which one. Let's just create with Material Designer. We're going to choose the emissive right there, and we'll hit continue. We'll go into the emissive channel. We'll change this base layer from a texture to a solid color, and then we're going to adjust that color right there. The hexadecimal that I have for that is 005FFFF. We'll hit OK, and I'm going to go back into the channels, and on the emissive strength there, I'm going to set that to 3. We want to save this out so that we can reuse it. So up here in the upper right-hand corner, I'm going to click on that and export this to Material Designer. And just like before, I'm going to label this text outline emissive and hit save on that. We can close that out, and now we can apply that. So even right here, I'm going to select it and type in MD_text. Select it, and then right here also select that, and then we'll add that to the rest of those text outlines. So I'm going to select that I, drop all the way down to the R, hit Shift and select, and then hit Control so I can deselect the null objects there, and then we'll jump back into the details for that, and we'll need to add it to all of these elements. An easy way to do that is to go into our content drawer and select that material. We'll save it also, hit Control S. Save it also, but make sure it's selected. Then we can close the content drawer, and then we can use this button right here to add that material to all of them. And so now we've added that to all of those outlines. I'm going to close up that cloner, and we can take a look at what we've got. Bring R2 back in. And so those outlines are creating an emissive color. They will create light. Right now, under the lighting that we have, you're not going to see that all that well, but we'll make changes to the lighting a little bit later. Now let's animate the text. I'll go into my timeline here and jump back to the beginning of the timeline. I'll do this one at a time. I'm going to select the fill first, and we'll need to drop down to that angle start property right there. And I'm going to add a keyframe right there at the beginning of the timeline. So you'll see that it adds in that text fill with that angle start property. There's our first keyframe. While I'm there, I'll go ahead and select the outline, do the same thing, angle start, and set that keyframe for it. So both of those are now in the sequencer with a keyframe right there at the beginning. We'll jump to the end, and with the timeline indicator at the end of the sequence, I'm going to set that to 1 on the angle start and hit that keyframe button right there. And we'll jump to the fill, do the same thing, set that keyframe. And so now both of them have been keyframed from the beginning and the end. I'm going to select all 4 of those because I want them to be linear so that the speed of the animation will be constant. So I'm going to right click on that and select linear. Make sure that they all 4 change to that triangle keyframe right there. And now we can take a look at that animation. It looks like I missed something on the D for the outline, so I'm going to go back in there, select it, and yes, I need to add that material in right there. It should still be selected and right there. The next piece that I want to build is the sign in the back, the industrial automaton. Now, according to Wikipedia, that is the company that makes the R2-Series. So to start out with this, I'm going to use a rectangle. So over here in our 2D shapes, I'm going to double click on the rectangle. And for this location, I'm going to go ahead and reset the location. We'll make some adjustments to the size so that we'll be able to see this in just a minute. So in the properties down here, on the mesh size, let's set this to free. And then we're going to type in 1700 by 500. And we'll create a quick material for this. I'm going to go ahead and add this into the material designer. We'll just go with a PBR, hit continue. And on the base color right there, we'll change this from a texture to a solid color. And then the hexadecimal that I'm using for this is 1E, 1C, 1F, FF. Hit OK on that, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to export this material and make sure that I am back in my materials folder right there. And I'm going to label this as sign background and hit save on it. I'll close that out. So on the location for this, I'm going to set this to 2476. And then I'm going to bring it up to 517 and a couple of more changes to it. We're going to round the edges of it. And to do that, we're going to go into this global bevel size right here. And we're going to crank that up to as close to as 250 as we can get. Just select it and hit 250 and it's going to resolve it to 249.89999994. I'm going to bring the subdivisions up so that these corners are smoother. I'm going to set that to 32. And that's our background for the sign. So that we can see this a little bit better, I'm going to jump out of the camera and I'm going to zoom in. I'm just using the W and E key right there to zoom in. I'm holding down the right button on my mouse and I'm just going to frame that up so that we can see this a little bit better. And we'll continue building this out. I want to create an outline for this, and we're going to just use that, duplicate it, and make some changes to it. So let me go find that in our outliner. There's our rectangle. I'm going to go ahead and label this as sign background. We'll duplicate it, Control D. We have sign background 2 right there. And once I'm done compiling shaders, I'm going to relabel that sign background 2 to sign outline. With that selected, we'll make some changes to it. We're going to keep the same mesh size, but we're going to change the distance, the location of it, and we're going to set this distance to 2403. It's going to be forward a bit, but we're going to extrude this and bevel it, and it will become an outline for this sign. So with it selected, we're going to add 3 modifiers to it. We'll go up to the operator stack. The first modifier we're going to need to add is the outline. Add that. You'll see now, of course, it is an outline. And we'll add the modifier extrude to it. And then one more modifier, the bevel modifier. In those modifiers, I'm going to make a few changes. On the extrude depth there, I'm going to set that to 110. And on the bevel, we'll set that to 5, inset, and 2 iterations on it. Now, in the original design, the way I'm lighting this mostly is going to be a red, trying to create a red neon looking tube around this. So we're going to need to create that tube. And then, of course, the material we add to all of this is going to light this up. So to create that tube, I'm going to go back into the Motion Design Outliner and I'm going to duplicate that outline, select it and hit Control D. And we'll label this sign neon. And on this one, we'll make some adjustments. With it selected in the details panel here, we'll change the distance to 2430. We'll scale it down, so deconstrain our scale settings here because we want to bring this down to 0.9625 and 0.9625. And then the last one is going to be 0.91. And now we'll make some changes to the modifiers. So again, make sure that sign neon is selected. We'll jump into our modifiers, bring this down so we can see them. And on the outline, we'll set this to 5. On the extrude, we'll set that to 5. And on the bevel inset, let's set this to 2.5. And we'll leave the iterations at 2. So you can see now we have that thin tube right there wrapping around inside of our sign. I'll create this red material for the neon first. So again, with it selected, let's just make sure that's selected, the sign neon, and we'll go into the details panel and let's drop down to our material and edit with Material Designer. We're only going to use the emissive channel, so I'm going to click on it. On our base layer right there, we're going to change that from a texture to a solid color. And we're going to change that once we've compiled shaders. I'm going to select that color and change it to a red color. I'm going to go with, on this, FF0005FF. We'll click OK on that. And I'm going to go back into the channels and I'm going to increase the strength of this emissive color. Remember that this will create light. I'm going to go from 1 to 10. And I'm going to save this. Export Material Designer Material. And I'm going to label this red neon and hit save. We'll close that out. And there is our red neon in our sign. Now we need to create our text for this. So we'll use a text actor. So over here in our motion design mode, actors right there, we'll double click on the text actor. We'll scroll down, there's our text actor right there, and I'm going to bring it back. The actual location I have set for this is 2400 by 0 by 523. I'll drop down into our text and we're going to create this text. Need to type in industrial. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and hit Enter so we can get a second line there. Automaton. And then we can hit Enter and that changes our text. We want to enforce everything to uppercase. And I'm going to change this font from Roboto. This one, I'm going to use Franklin Gothic. That's just the one that I came across that seemed to look somewhat like what I wanted. And I'm going to change the typeface to heavy italic. I'm going to center align this. And we're going to need to scale this up to 3.7. Need to do that on all of them. I should have constrained that back together, but this will work. And we're going to close this gap right here on our leading, and it'll be our line spacing right there. We'll set that to a -18. A few more adjustments to this. I want to go into the geometry down here, and on the extrude, I'm going to extrude this 20, and on the bevel, we'll set that to 2. And we'll leave everything else as is. And then we're going to need to create some materials for this. I'm going to drop all the way down here to our materials so that we have our front material, bevel, extrude, and back. For the front material, I'm going to create with Material Designer. Going to make this very simple. Just going to click on the PBR continue right there. Go into the base channel. I'm going to change this to a solid color and I'm going to leave that at black. I am going to save this out. Export material, go back into my materials right there, and I'm just going to label this as black, save that, and we can close that out. The bevel material, I'm going to create it. Again, just go with a PBR, continue. I'm going to make this emissive so that it doesn't need lights for it to show. So we'll click on emissive right there. We'll change this from a texture to a solid color. And we'll change this color to the same red that we used earlier on the neon. That'll be FF0005FF. Just to be on the safe side, I'm seeing this texture shine through on that. So I'm going to go back into the base color And I'm going to change this from a texture to a solid color, and we'll leave it black. And then we'll go into the channels, and on the emissive strength, we'll make sure that that is set to 1. And then we'll export this out, and we'll label this as red emissive text. And we can close that one out. And on our extrude right here, we'll create that again, just very quickly, very simple. We'll go to the base color there, make that a white solid. Hit OK, and then go into the emissive, and we want to make that a white solid also. In the channels, we'll leave that at 1, and let's save this one out as white emissive. And we can close it out. I'm going to go back into my main camera, click right there, and choose that cine camera right there. I think at this point will be a good time to start working with our lighting so we can get a little bit better feel of how this is going to look. There's some lighting in here under the default scene. I'm going to open that up, and we have a skylight and a directional light. I'm actually going to get rid of those, but I'll do that in just a minute. The first thing that I'm going to add in is I'm going to add in a rec light. We're mostly going to focus the lighting on R2D2 right here in this area. So to add that light in, we'll come over here to our motion design mode, go to lights, and I want a rec light. So right there, we'll double click on it. And that should be right there at the bottom. We'll make sure that it's selected, get a good look at our details. And I'm going to change this location. So I'm going to set this to a negative 385, tab over 0. We'll leave that, and then we'll set that at 500. And then on rotation, on the Y rotation right there, I'll set that to a negative 45. Then we'll drop down into the lighting properties themselves. On the intensity, I'm going to bring this up to 25,000. Attenuation radius, we'll leave that at 1,000. The source width, I'm going to bring that up to 415. Source height, we'll set that to 255. We'll leave the door angle and the length as they are. Now with that light set in there, I'll go ahead and for right now, I'll just turn off these two, the skylight and the directional light. I'm going to add in one more light for some backlight and to add some more color to the floor here. It'll be a spotlight. So back in our lights over here, I'm going to double click on spotlight, and that should be right down there at the bottom of our stack. Select it, and I'm going to make some changes to it. So on the location, I'm going to set this to 216. Going to leave Y at 0 and Z at 650. And I'm going to set the rotation at that negative 90 right there. And then the intensity, we'll bring this up to 60,000. And I'm going to change this color right here from white to a blue. And the hexadecimal on that is going to be 0060FFFF. Hit OK on that. And then our attenuation radius, I'm going to bring that up to 1500. The inner cone, I'm going to set that at 35. The outer cone, I'm going to set it at 45. And what that does is you have an inner cone and outer cone, and it just creates a fade between those so that it's not a harsh line. The source radius, I'll set that at 900. We'll leave the soft source as is, and then the source length right there, I'll bring that up to 1,000. All right, I'm going to jump out of this camera and we'll go take a look at this. Go up a little bit, look down. I'll hit that label so that we're seeing pretty much just the scene. And so there we have our lighting for this scene. To finish up our lighting, just so this doesn't cause us problems later, I'm going to go ahead and delete that skylight and that directional light. That way in rendering, or if we close the project out and open it back up, those lights won't give us any trouble. Going to make sure we save everything, Control-Shift-S. And now I'm going to build these side walls that we have here. To build these side walls, we're going to use a couple of rounded rectangles and then a cloner. So let's go ahead and we'll go back to our 2D shapes right there. And let's just double click on a rectangle. Adds that in. Let's reset our location for that. It's right there inside of R2. For this first rectangle, let's go down to the mesh size here. Let's make sure that's set to free. and we'll set this size to 80, and then we can tab over and set that to 300. So we can see it. I will bring it out a little bit in front. So there's that rectangle. And I'm going to drop back down to our shape here. And on our global bevel size right here, let's set that up to 40. And it's going to default to that 39.9. And on the subdivisions here, let's crank that up to 128. So that's going to round those edges there. We've already created a material for this, so I'm going to add that in. We'll go down here to the material, click on Simple and Asset, and we're just going to use that emissive white. So MD_white emissive right there, we can select it. We're going to create one more rectangle, so I'm just going to reset the location for that, and then go back up here to rectangle, double click on it, reset the location so that we can see this one a little bit better. I'm going to bring it out forward just a little bit and make changes to it. Down on the mesh size again, we'll change this to 80 and tab over by 600. And then we'll round the edges with that global bevel size. We'll crank that up and then crank up our subdivisions there. And just like we did before, we will go into the material type, select Asset, search for that white emissive, and add that to it. Then I'll just reset this location back to center. And we're going to drop those two into a cloner. So in our actors over here, let's double click on cloner actor. And like we did earlier, we're going to need to get rid of that default cube right there. So let's open that up, select that default cube and delete it. And then we'll add these two rectangles in. So select them both and drag them down into the cloner, cloning those two rectangles. And we're going to make some adjustments to this cloner. This will be for the left side. So with the cloner selected, I'll come back to the location and rotation in just a minute. I'm going to drop down and we're going to leave this on grid. And on the X, we'll set that to 1. On the Y, let's set that to 21. And on the Z count, let's set that to 4. And then we'll adjust our spacing a little bit. We'll leave the X and Y as is. And on the Z, we'll change that to 475. And so that has created the look that we want for this side wall. I'm going to go back up to the location, and this is going to be our left. So we'll go ahead and label that left wall and make some adjustments to our location and rotation so that we get this set in place. For location, let's set this to 1400. We'll tab over and we'll set this to a negative 2118. And then tab over and 676. We're going to need to rotate it on that Z axis right there, 90 degrees. It disappears, so we're going to jump out of our camera right there. And you can see now that that wall is in place. It's going to be easy enough to create our right wall because all we'll need to do is duplicate this and make a few adjustments. So with it selected, hit Control D. And we can label this number 2 as right wall. And on the cloner, make sure it's selected. Pretty much just need to change the Y-axis right here to 2118. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-S to save everything. We don't see these walls from the main shot, but when we angle the camera around, we do see them. So I'm going to go back to camera and hit our camera, and there we have it. The last pieces I want to add into this are 2 columns in the side. I'll go ahead and start working on building those. I'm going to jump into the 3D shapes here, and I'm going to use a cone to build these columns. I'm going to double click on that cone and then reset the location there. I'm going to drop down here to the mesh size real quick to change that. I'm going to set that to free, and the size that I want to go with on this is 400 by 400 by 1775. And we're going to increase the top radius because right now it is a cone and we want to increase that top radius so that it's more of a cylinder. And I'll bring those sides up to 64 just to make that a little bit smoother. I'll go ahead and create the material for this so that we can apply it here, and then we'll move it over into place. We'll actually duplicate it and move it to the left and to the right. For this material, I'm going to go down here into the material properties, go to simple, and of course change that to material designer. I'm going to go with an emissive on this because again, this is going to be over an area where there's not much lighting, and I'm going to hit continue on that. In the emissive color, I'm going to change this from a texture to a solid color, and then we'll change that color. The hexadecimal on that is 000E1FFF. I'm going to add an effect to this. With that layer selected, go to Effects, and we're going to add in Generate Grid Lines. Make some changes down here on the width. I'm going to set that to 16 and jump down to the height and set that to 10. Jump down to the thickness and set that to 4. I'm going to stagger the offset here. I'm going to set that to 3.4. I'll leave the corner radius at 1. And then I'm going to change this color A, select it, and type in 000A18FF. Hit OK on that, and I'll save this as a material. I'm going to export it, Material, Material Designer, and I'll label this as Column Grid. Save that and close it, and then going to make sure that that is the material that we've selected. Right here, go to Asset, and then search for COLUM and select that column grid right there. I'm going to go ahead and slide this over to the left. So back up at my location there, I'm going to set this at 2560, tab over and set that to a negative 2010, tab over and set that to 683. To see this, I'll jump out of the camera so you'll see it right there, and I'll duplicate it and send it to the right. So let's go ahead and label this left column. We'll duplicate it, Control D, and label this one right column. And then we'll make a change to that location, and we have both of those columns added in. To animate the camera, we're going to need to add it into the sequencer. So I'll go back up here to the default scene where it's located, grab that first camera and bring it in and drop it. When we add that first camera in, it should also add in a camera cuts track. We'll use that also in just a minute when we animate other cameras in this scene. So this first camera, you can create whatever camera movement you want to. I just created 3 simple camera movements. I'm going to jump back to the beginning of the timeline right there, and I'm going to jump down into the transform properties for this, and I'm going to use location and rotation on it. So I'll set keyframes for that, for both of those. And I did a 5-second animation on this, so I'll jump to 150 frames in the sequence, and I'll go into the location properties, and I'll bring that up a good bit, set that to a negative 50, and then I'll rotate it just slightly. We can go back to the beginning of the timeline and watch this animation. Now, I do want this to start off with linear keyframes right there, so I'm going to select those and set that to linear. I do want that camera move to ease into that stop. Jump back and take a look at that animation. I'm going to close up this camera, and we're going to add in another camera. I'll duplicate this camera, Control D, and so there's our second camera. I'm going to set my timeline indicator at 150 frames, and then I'll bring this in, drop it in. There's our second camera. It has that same animation on it. That second camera is in there. I'm going to bring this up a little bit so we can see more of our sequence and work with this a little bit better. I'll close up those. I just need the transform properties right here. What I'm going to do is move this down in the timeline, this entire animation for this camera. So grabbing this gray bar and bringing it down this way, and it'll snap right there. I'm going to change all of these animations, so I'll just jump into them and delete them. To create this second camera move, I'm going to select that camera, click right there. Now we're seeing that camera. And I'll go down here into the transform properties and I'll start sliding this camera over. Bring it over a good bit. I'll try -900 on that and then rotate it. Need to drop down into my rotation properties here and rotate that on the yaw option there. Set that up, maybe about like that. We'll try it and see. And I'm going to need to set keyframes for both of those properties that I just moved. Set those keyframes. And then again, I'll just do 5 seconds on this. So I'll jump to 300 and basically just going to set this to 900 and then set that to a -22. And that should bring us around to the other side. Let's take a look. Now what we want to do is we want to tell our camera cuts to cut from this camera to this camera at this point right here. So at 150 is where we want that to cut. So timeline indicator right there, we'll go to camera cuts, and on the plus button right there, we'll go to that second camera. So we've animated it and we've told the camera cuts to make that cut. We can select the camera cuts there, and now we'll be watching the camera cuts rather than the individual cameras. And we can go back to the beginning of the timeline and hit play. There's our first camera move. And I do want, again, on this animation for these two to be linear. So I'll select all of those, right click, and go to linear. And I'll take a look at that again real quick. And we'll cut to a final camera right there at 300. So just like what we did, we'll duplicate this camera, Control D. We'll have that third camera right there. I'll bring that down into the timeline and we'll move this. So like we did just before, open up the transform properties. I'm going to select those and delete them. Go to 300 in the timeline. Go in here to location, reset this back to 0. Go down to rotation and set this back to 0. And I do need to select that camera, select it right there. On this move, I think what I'll do is I'm going to push in, and what we'll do is we'll set it up and then pull back out with this camera. So I'll try a -1600 right there and see about tilting this down a little bit more. So I'll set that to a -3, 1600 right there. Set keyframes for both of them. And I'll jump to about 390 and go ahead and pull this back out. And we'll set this to -1 and just frame that up nicely right there. Set that maybe to a -2500. I want these first two to be linear and the last two to be cubic on the animation type. And we'll jump back to the beginning. We do need to make sure that we select our camera cuts and make that camera cut right there at 300. So with our timeline indicator right there, we'll jump back into camera cuts and we'll choose that third camera. Select my camera cuts and I'll actually open this up a little bit more so we can see it and hit play on it. This isn't really a big deal, but I believe on the original animation on this sign outline right here, the material that I had assigned to it was a white. So I'm just going to select asset right there and search for that white emissive and add that in. Changes it up just a little bit, makes it pop out a little bit better. Other than that, this is pretty much what we created from the original. I hope this has been helpful. For more on motion design in Unreal Engine, check out my other tutorials and hit the like and subscribe button.